Before we begin this episode, a content warning. Father will be discussing topics of an adult nature. While these are important issues and Catholics must be aware of the morality of these topics and not just turn a blind eye to them, this episode would not be suitable for young children, and parents are encouraged to listen to this episode before prudentially judging whether their older children should listen along with them. We'll pause here for a few moments before beginning. Welcome to the SSPX Podcast, and this week we will be addressing the sensitive topic of pregnancies out of wedlock. These occurrences, though hopefully rare, do happen, and Catholics should know how to address them prudently and in the light of Catholic moral teaching. Moreover, out-of-wedlock pregnancies raise a host of questions, with the most prevalent being, must the father and the mother of the child enter into marriage? This was the main question from a listener which sparked this episode. But Father Ian Palko and I will dive into some connected questions as well concerning the relationship between unwed parents, their respective roles in a child's life, and how we as Christians ought to treat them and their situation. Don't forget all of our previous episodes are available at sspxpodcast.com. There you can ask questions, you can subscribe to the podcast, and if you like this content, you can do a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation to help us continue this work. Now let's join Father Ian Palko for Questions with Father. Father Palko, it is great to have you back again. You and I were talking a little bit ahead of time. It kind of seems like you are our go-to moral theologian. Whenever we have questions of this nature, you get the short end or long end of the stick, depending.
Yeah, it's especially on those dicey questions. I think it was just I remember when back in the apologetics episode, we were planning it out and Father Robinson had asked me, hey, do you want to take one of these? I thought, well, I just done a moral theology for a high school students class. And I thought, I'll just use my notes. And apparently that was it was the imprudent thing to do.
Now you're locked in. Sorry.
Yeah, well, it is what it is. And we're supposed to study these things, and none of us are going to be, we have to be humble enough, all of us priests, to understand that we're not going to know everything. But if that's the questions I get asked, I guess the Holy Ghost is going to give me at least a little bit of help behind all of this. So.
Yeah, well, I'm sure so. And let's dive right into it, Father. The question is, and we've gotten this in a couple different formats, but I'll just read this question out. Mm-hmm. We made a mistake and we got pregnant out of wedlock. Do we have to get married now? So let's start with the broad question.
Yep, sure.
And then dive into some of the details, Father.
Yeah, I think it's often great if, though, a scholastic, somebody who studied in scholasticism, I guess would be, or somebody who's trying to make the necessary distinctions in moral theology, oftentimes the correct answer to give at the beginning is, well, it depends. But in this case, I think we could just give a very simple answer and then maybe explain. So the answer, pregnant out of wedlock, do we have to get married? The short answer is no. And there's going to be a number of different things we have to consider to really understand that answer. But the question is posed in such a way where it's easy to give that kind of answer. Is this a sin? When we get questions like that, it's sometimes objectively something is a sin. But here, because it's a do we have to, it's a pretty simple, straightforward answer, although there's a lot behind it. So the answer really is, no, you don't have to get married now, but maybe you should, but maybe you shouldn't. We have to look at those factors, and that's part of the longer answer.
Okay. So how do you help let's say a couple engaged or not comes to you for advice and they say, should we get married, Father? What are the kind of questions that you're going to ask them in order to help them make a good decision?
Right. So I think first thing, we have to see who they actually are. It's going to be a little different if this is a otherwise good Catholic couple who has just, they've given into their passions and, otherwise they're sort of almost on the path to being ready for marriage, versus somebody who is not really living a good Catholic life otherwise. And this is just sort of going to be one of the consequences of living that kind of life. I mean, ultimately, when we have these situations in which there's not a necessity to do something, there's not a precept of the church, there's not some kind of moral law, canon law, natural law that obliges a certain action, we have to step back and we have to put it all in the hands of prudence, the virtue of prudence. That's going to regulate all of our actions. So we have the theological virtues, but then underneath of those theological virtues are all those moral virtues, the queen of which we say is prudence, because it takes stock of human actions and it directs them towards the end. And here, obviously, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to direct these things towards the end. And so we're going to ask various questions to see whether marriage is a prudent solution. And any real solution, when there's not a necessity in law for these things, requires prudence. And prudence is not just some kind of thing, okay, what do we pick the best situation, and we have these things called political prudence by which we sort of, we exercise a sort of politicking, or a carnal prudence where we try to set things up so we get the best thing possible for us out of it. The true virtue of prudence is 3 different acts. St. Thomas is going to talk about it this way. We could go at length on this. There's books written on this, but it's just simple to say you need counsel first. And that's sort of the data taking, right? Any scientist, before he's going to come up with or prove his theory or whatever, he needs data. And this is the data taking. You're going to ask the priest, you're going to ask yourself, you're going to ask good other people, you're going to investigate what does the church teach on this thing? Who is this person I'm with? What's the situation? You take the data. What's the prognosis? Here, ultimately, you also need a very supernatural viewpoint, because we can easily solve questions too naturally. So you look at all of those things. The second act is going to be, now, given this data, what seems to be the best solution possible on a natural and supernatural level? That's what we call judgment or deliberation. And then finally, we've made a good decision. We execute on that decision. If we don't do it that way, if we don't ask the necessary questions that we'll hopefully get to in a second here, we have an imprudent action. We could not take counsel as we should. We jump too quickly. We rush into judgment without deliberation, or we fail to follow through. This is the David Bathsheba problem, right? As, hey, we have a bad situation. Let's fix this. I have a great idea. I'll just try to hide this here. And we're not trying to really solve a problem there. It's not a moral solution. It's always imprudent. It's just quickly rushing to it. It's not admitting the fault and then trying to solve it. We're trying to cover up the problem. And ultimately, an act of adultery ends up in murder. That's not a good solution. And so it doesn't solve the problem. It actually makes it worse. And when we see God punishes that in a particular way. So, when we're answering a question like this, again, we have to go back and understand, does the church, divine, natural, church law, civil law, do these things command a certain action? So let's look at that. Does divine law command marriage after you've committed fornication? No, nowhere in it does it. Natural law, while a child's supposed to have a mother and father and that stability of a family, it doesn't require that in every case. Obviously, a widow or a widower isn't obliged to marry and raise the children after they've been widowed. The church, nowhere in her law, commands that marriage has to happen after fornication. And while there are a few civil laws that have touched on this, no Catholic country ever forced marriage just as a result of fornication. Certainly, it encouraged the couple, by what it punished various other ways, to take responsibility for this. But they would punish things like fornication or rape or seduction or adultery or abduction, but not forcing marriage. And that's kind of important, because we don't want to force people into a situation that is supposed to be free, right? It's supposed to be a free act.
In the Old Testament, there seems to be a moral precept, a little bit of a pushback there, Father, on in Deuteronomy. It says pretty clearly that if a man does this to a woman, that he is bound to marry her. Is this a case of old law versus new law? Then we get into the question of, can law change? What do you say to that, Father?
Well, so St. Thomas answers the question of whether law can change or not. And that's in the, as I recall correctly, I think it's the question 90s or so of the Prima Secundae. But he says law can change. Even human law can change. The question ends up being here, is this a human law or a divine law? I mean, it's given by God. But is it a matter of precept, which could be changed? Does it apply to everybody at all time, like the Ten Commandments? Or is it a law of, we could say, a law of precept that was for this time in this way, it certainly solve a particular situation? If we look at this this law in Deuteronomy, we also see that he's supposed to pay the father, right? But you also then go to the same Pentateuch, right? A little bit later in the writings of the law, you have Exodus 22. I think it's verse 16 and 17. And here, it's almost the exact repetition of this same precept. But now the father can object to this and prevent the marriage. So already, even in the law, we see a difference in practice here. We see that it doesn't apply in all cases, and there are exceptions to it. And there's also something of the time. Today, we don't have the situation as much, I would say. Maybe in more traditional circles it's this way, but that a woman who isn't a virgin or who has a child isn't able easily to marry in the Old Testament in many societies before sort of modern times. And in the New Covenant, a lot of these laws of precept don't carry over. They were for that time in that way. For instance, you can have some bacon now and it's a good thing, right? I remember, as an aside, I remember at one point in time, this was as a priest, a family was leaving, and I was asked to make a meal for them, and every part of the dish had bacon in it, even the dessert. So a little bit of a theme, like it's good to be Catholic, as it were. So
it is,
yeah. But it doesn't apply. The pushback's good. I mean, but we don't apply every single law. We already know that certain precepts of the Old Testament, like circumcision, don't carry through. It doesn't mean that you can't do it this way. It doesn't mean, obviously, we don't say circumcision is wrong, but it doesn't mean you can't follow this law. You can't. The state couldn't say, well, if you commit this crime of fornication or of adultery, that you have to pay some penalty. But it doesn't mean that you should always do this in all circumstances. That was for that time. And we can see by the different practices, even in the Old Testament, that that's the case.
Okay. So it seems, well, not it seems, it is the case then. This is a marriage is a sacrament that people need to enter into freely. Mm-hmm. And so neither can you physically force nor psychologically force or entice someone into a sacrament.
That's right? Well, you can't force them into a contract. And ultimately, while marriage is a sacrament, it's firstly a contract. Every sacrament of the new law has an analogy to our life, and it is essentially something. Baptism is essentially a washing. Penance is essentially a tribunal. And marriage is essentially a contract. It's where the spouse gives to the other the right over his or her body for acts proper to generation. And because of that, there's a contract there. If I put a gun to your head and said, give me $200, I'm not going to say that's a contract. We freely agreed that, no, you didn't freely agree at all. There's a gun to your head. Right. So any contract that's entered into with force applied to it, whether that be a physical force or a fear or a psychological force, right? And I think an impending child is probably a pretty strong psychological force here, whether that's because you want to be virtuous and solve the problem properly, or whether it's because you're not sure what to do under these circumstances and you're really worried and somebody's going to find out. Maybe we can hide this by getting married and then no one will know, et cetera. Those shotgun marriages, that impugns our consent. It undermines that possible consent to these things. And as a result of that, the physical force or psychological force could make that consent actually impossible and invalidate the marriage. It's not. There's not been a few cases, in fact, where tribunals have invalidated a marriage because of some kind of force. Even simply the insistence of mom, you got to marry this guy. You've done something wrong. You got to marry this guy. Or dad, there are cases that I've read about. This is the case. A tribunal has said, nope, there's, and this is not modern tribunals that are, seem to look for an easy way out here. These are the traditional tribunals from, 100 years ago that are making these kinds of decisions. The other thing to remember about marriage, too, is it entails a commitment to sanctity of each other and the children. Entered into quickly, how are you going to promote sanctity? I mean, do you ever, promote sanctity out of fear? The church certainly doesn't want to convert people out of fear. Is this a way of converting somebody out of fear? I mean, if fear pushes them to do the right thing, maybe there's a certain good to it, but it's not something we want to promote that way. Ultimately, the salvation of the child and the parents is the utmost priority, and that's why it's a question of prudence.
Okay, so. I mean, I guess boiling it down to its simplest form, if entering into a marriage is going to be a bad thing for the spouses and for the child, then don't. Right. It's as simple as that. Simply put, it's that, right? We started off badly with a lack of virtue in the conception of this child, right? But the child does need a virtuous mother and father if it's going to become a saint. So perhaps these people are now going to own the problem and they're really going to step up and do what they need to do, right? Right. But if the father's not going to be a saintly father and spouse, it might not be better that he's not in the picture at all, maybe except provide financial support, which he has to do. Mm-hmm. But maybe the mother's not going to be saintly if she's involved in some difficulties. If this is the result of her living in a bad way, it might not be even good for her to raise the child herself. Maybe the family, her family, or the husband, or not husband, but the father's family here, or another adoptive, good traditional Catholic home would do a much better job of making this child into a saint. That's something to consider, and that's where prudence enters into the question as well, right? Mm-hmm. The child is an image of God, and the child is also sees in a father the image of God. It's going to be a great influence there. So if the father's not a great example of a virtuous man, the child is going to end up thinking that God lacks those virile qualities. Or if the father is unconcerned with the child, well, maybe now God doesn't really care. Or if the father's an ogre and just a selfish man, then God's just this, petty, selfish dictator who rules my life. We don't want to be leading a child that way. So if that's the situation that's set up, well, that may not be a good idea to make the child live in a household where that's the example of dad. Or if the mother, for instance, she has a duty to nurture and essentially lead the child gently to his father, right? And so if she's too hard or too soft, lacking in virtue, she too can create great damage. I mean, in a certain sense, that's the image of the Blessed Mother in this situation here. But yeah, if there's real virtue, if they're really willing to own the problem, if in a certain sense they were weak in virtue and now they realize for the good of this child, they need to step up and they're going to try to fix the sin part first, then act prudently and consider these things and provide themselves with the means to virtue. And then maybe marriage is a good idea, but marriage doesn't cause virtue. Marriage presupposes virtue. I mean, we've talked a bit before about sort of the sexual mores of the Catholic Church in other episodes. And it has to be said here too. I mean, marriage doesn't cause chastity, right? You're going into marriage. You have to have this virtue to begin with, or you're just going to find other ways to violate the virtue within marriage. It doesn't cause virtue. It gives you a vehicle by which virtue should be easier, but it doesn't cause it. And the same thing is going to happen in a situation like this. Marriage is not going to make these spouses or these potential spouses, these parents, virtuous. It may reflect their virtue. It may provide those kinds of things, but it doesn't cause the virtue. Right. I was teaching juniors and seniors something very similar recently, and I'm sure you do the same, Father, saying, if a guy that you're dating, if you're a girl, if a guy you're dating is a dirtbag, marriage isn't going to fix him being a dirtbag. I mean, it might. There is sacramental grace and it's possible, but walk away.
Yeah.
Don't just presume that all of a sudden he's going to turn into the most virtuous saint in the world because of it.
Indeed. And especially if he's going to take advantage of your virtue, if he's going to take advantage of that and be selfish enough to seek out this carnal pleasure, even despite the consequences that he should obviously know about, well, then I think we already have a problem there. And maybe, again, that could be overcome. Maybe we realize this was a mistake and now we're going to live virtuously and we're going to try our best and we're going to take good advice. But yeah, if he's a dirtbag, I have to say it this way too. If we're going around dating non-Catholics as a normal thing, that's setting ourselves up for a massive problem here. Rarely is the virtue going to be respected. And even if it is, you're setting yourself up for a terrible problem. And then add a child into this. It's not as if we can wait for a little while and see if this person's going to convert or if they're willing to pursue virtue. We're already in a situation where now we have a non-Catholic involved here. And the church, mixed marriage is a danger of the faith. The church tolerates it because it might be better under a certain circumstance than an invalid marriage outside the church. But she does not like it. She does not promote it. Historically, that mixed marriage was done like on the church steps or in the sacristy. It was not celebrated in the church for good reason, because it is a danger of the faith. It may be the better thing than the worse, but it's not the ideal of the Catholic here. And if this child is going to be raised Catholic to save his soul, flirting around with these bad things in a situation with a non-Catholic around, it might be better to keep the non-Catholic as far away from the child as possible, so the child might be able to be raised Catholic, even in marriage, right? When we have to prepare a mixed marriage, the non-Catholic is going to have to swear on the scriptures that he will or she will raise the children Catholic, even if the Catholic in the situation dies. And even to baptize a child, we need the founded hope that the child is going to be raised Catholic. Right? These situations set up too many times where it's obvious that the child isn't going to be raised Catholic, and so we can't baptize the child. Grandma really, really wants the child to be baptized, and she's like, "Well, we'll raise it unless we have a founded hope, we can't even baptize the child." And so they need, the parents in a bad situation like this need to set that up first. Let's take things one step at a time, right? We've created a problem. Let's solve the problem. The marriage doesn't solve the problem. The first thing one has to be, if one has a child, is a good mother or a good father. After that, now once there's some virtue here, we see this situation can work, then we can marry if that's a prudent thing to do. And it might be, or it might not be.
Yeah. And so it might be embarrassing. Yes.
Yeah.
It might be shameful based on society, based on your family, all these things. Yes. But that doesn't mean, to use a phrase from Father McFarland talking about the vocation series, you don't get to hitch your wagon to someone who's going to drag your soul down. Right. That's for eternity.
Yeah. If you hitch your wagon to that, it's going to be really hard to stop it once it goes off the cliff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we could say here in conclusion, because this sort of answers the main question, like it's a question of prudence. So no, you don't have to get married. In certain cases, it may be a great idea. This mistake, and with repentance for it, it may make sense to marry and help promote the sanctification of this couple and child. But in other cases, the most virtuous thing and the best thing for the child might not be to compound mistakes. And instead, in this case, maybe not marry, and maybe wait for marriage or wait for the right person to come along who can help you with this, or simply live a single life that's now chaste to make up for your sins of unchastity, which maybe that's going to best promote this virtue. And then maybe other family, grandpa, whatever, it ends up being that great male role model that this child needs.
Right. So that's the main question. I do have a few follow-up questions, Father. Just related to this, and I guess these questions are all supposing that this has taken place. As Catholics, as members of the mystical body, and as members of churches and parishes, just broadly, how are we to deal with or to treat or to think of unwed mothers and fathers as a Catholic?
Well, I think firstly, we need to start having some of the ladies in the Altar and Rosary Society make red A's to put on the chest. No, we're not. No. We're not in Protestant New England. Like, that's not.
Father, someone's gonna clip that and take that out of context. That's happening.
Probably is, but we can always make another podcast on that one.
Fair enough. Let's do it.
Yeah. So
no, but that's a great point.
No, we're not Protestants. We're not Calvinists. Like, we believe in redemption. So we hate the sin. I mean, it's the common thing to say. We hate the sin, but we're not the sinner, right? We want the sinner to repent. And as soon as that's happened, right? As soon as the sinner has gone to confession and now is resolved to try to fix the situation, we're happy. We should be happy to receive them. We should help them in their situation of embarrassment and understand that it is when people make mistakes or when people are in a bad situation, the Catholics step up and help them. That's the virtue of mercy. Mercy isn't this kind of, nice thing, or like this, we don't actually hold people to account for their sins or problems like that you hear in the modern days here. What is mercy? Mercy is the virtue that inclines us to see the decrepitude, to see the faults, to see the things that are missing in that other person, the evil that's there, and to try to relieve that thing out of charity. It's related to charity. It falls under other virtues, but it's related to charity there. So we have to act with charity. And so we see this person who is suffering from their own sins. Yes. They're suffering an evil, a difficulty, an embarrassment. What do? We should step up and try as best we can to help them. Maybe it's by making some meals. Maybe it's by befriending them and seeing if they need somebody to take care of their kid while they're having to go to work and support that child. Maybe it's, as a teacher in a school or as a priest, making sure that they have the spiritual help that they need, that they have, maybe it's a matter of helping to fund their tuition so they can go to one of our good schools. And so they have a good example there. There's plenty of ways of doing that. And you hear this all the time about pro-life Christians who falsely and truly, unfortunately, are accused of not supporting mothers. We want babies, but we don't want to help the mothers to have babies. Yeah. No, Catholics should be ready to help that. Now, if somebody is behaving in an unrepentant and promiscuous way, well, that's one thing, and we can't support that. But if they've repented of their sins, they're trying to live a virtuous life. We have to encourage them and support them. It's mercy that demands that we do that, and it's charity also that demands that we do that.
Right. You hear stories, thankfully not as common, but you hear stories of a child, being treated poorly because they're illegitimate, and again, the child resulting from this act is still a child of God, is presumably baptized, is all the things. How dare we treat any child differently or treat the mother differently? We offer help, period. End of story.
Yeah, well, if you're going to treat them differently, it's because you see the misery that they're in and you try to relieve it. Like, you take stock of the fact that they're in a bad situation and you help. So in that way, you maybe treat them differently than you would somebody who has more support. But you don't treat them differently in a way to play the Calvinist who just sort of like, he says, oh, clearly you're part of the unelect. Now we have you own up to the problem and you help them with their problem. Yeah. Right.
How would in this hypothetical situation, how would the mother tell the child about such issues? What is the mother to do in terms of telling the child about their circumstances, presuming that she remains unwed?
Yeah. Well, there's also a problem, and I know of a couple of situations where actually it's the father who has to do this, right? The dad has control of the child, raising the child, or there's other similar problems with mom running off or dad running off or whatever. And so it could be either parent. Oftentimes we view it because it's more common that it's the mother who's raising a child who's a single mother, but it can be the other way around. I think we're going to have to look at, and maybe a related question here too, is that we have, what do you do with any child when you have to tell them about this kind of thing? What about their friend, or you see somebody and they're asking like, but she's not married and she has a baby. Like, I think we should always say that children need to, and again, this could be clipped in the wrong way, so let's not do that, but children need to be exposed in a certain sense to the sinful world. We don't want them to experience sin. We don't want them to fall into sin, but we do want to encourage them to virtue. And virtuous action requires, in a certain sense, that they know evil, not in the way that our Lord knows evil. He knows of its existence. He sees the problem, but he doesn't obviously experience it. He does not sin. Right? The Blessed Virgin Mary knew of problems, probably knew about, things like Mary Magdalene's issues, right? And she was helping with them. She was acting virtuously. She wasn't sinning. So to be exposed to the existence of these problems is not a bad thing, provided that we accommodate that to the child in such a way that they're going to behave virtuously. It's what we mean when we say ignorance is not innocence. Innocence is the lack of the experience of having sinned. Ignorance is just not knowing. And while, about these things, St. Paul said they should not be named amongst you, right? Because we shouldn't be doing them first. They are a reality, and we have to deal with them. Unnecessary exposure for a child to sin obviously is sinful, but inoculating them in a certain sense with the knowledge and virtue that's going to protect them is virtuous and really important. It's part of a formation of a child. And so when we're having to explain these delicate matters to children, we have to speak at their level. We provide them only what is necessary. And by the questions they will ask of us, they'll tell us whether they need to have more information, whether they understand or not. It's the same way we really should go about educating them with regard to, the sacred mysteries of life, the birds and the bees, those kinds of things. You take the opportunity that's there without exposing them to sin. You explain the answer to the question that they've asked. You don't give more information. You don't give less information. You don't be overly euphemistic. You just be straightforward with them. And sometimes it's a simple answer, right? It might be a question of, for instance, here explaining. So we teach children when they're growing up that it's married couples, a mother and a father. It's mom and dad. When they get married, they have children. You don't explain necessarily how the children come about. And then you get this question, let's say, but you're not married, mom, and you have me. Or, she's not married, mom, she's not married, dad, and yet she has a child. Right? So here's an example of a simple answer. It's not, there are a multitude of different ways you could go about this, but an example here. So you might tell this child, and adapt it as you will for being informed of their own parentage, or somebody being answering the question for another child, for instance, here. We could say something like, well, little Johnny, some people pretend sometimes to be what they're not. That's what we mean when we say they're lying. And that's a sin. And you don't want to lie. Especially you don't want to lie about big things, or you don't want to pretend about big things, right? If you went into the confessional and you pretended to forgive somebody's sins, that would be very bad, or if you pretended to baptize somebody, that would be a very great sin. When you have very sacred things and you pretend about these very sacred things, that's a very great sin. And marriage is a very sacred thing. So if you pretend to be married, that's a very big sin, and you shouldn't do that. You understand? And little Johnny might say, yeah, I understand. Okay. And maybe that's all you need to say. Maybe explaining that, and then he'll put the rest together. Or maybe he says, but she's not married. Like, well, sometimes people don't actually get married, but they pretend to be married and they act like they're married. And so sometimes because they're acting like they're married, they can have a child, even though they're not actually married. They're just pretending, but they're not actually married in God's eyes. And so that baby, that's not a bad thing, right? People aren't bad things. That's a very good thing. But even if mommy and daddy in that situation did something wrong, the baby's still good. And if mommy and daddy in that situation are really sorry for their sins, they can confess their sins and they can be back in the state of grace. And then they can try to fix the damage that's caused. And sometimes that is by they get married, and sometimes that means they don't get married. But the baby has to be taken care of, just like I and mom or whatever take care of you. Right. So you see how we're going down this sort of road at their level, explaining things in a simple way that, okay, people do bad things. People commit sins. And just because they commit sins doesn't mean they can't be sorry for it. but the whole time we're extolling the virtue. Marriage is sacred. Marriage is a good thing. The baby is a good thing. And sometimes people do bad things, and that's bad, and you shouldn't want to do that, right? So we go down that line, and then we show them that they can fix problems, but they shouldn't get into the problem. So you say something to finish it off, like, well, so you understand it's bad to lie and bad to pretend about things. And that's not meaning you can pretend, it's not bad to pretend to cook or pretend to build your fort and you fight with swords, because those aren't sacred things. But marriage is a sacred thing. So you don't pretend about that. And you're not going to do that, are you? No, I'm not going to do that. Okay. Well, especially because, maybe God is wanting you to be a holy priest or a holy nun or a holy brother. And if you pretend to be married like that, you might not ever be able to do that. And you don't want to do that. So we bring it down to their level. We explain it simply. We answer their questions, and they learn from that virtue. They learn they shouldn't lie. They shouldn't pretend about sacred things. They should respect marriage and God. And this person's a good person, even though they've done bad things. Like, you explain it on that level, and you will expose them to the fact that people do sin without encouraging any sin in them. And you can, that's how, actually, in a more generic way, that's how we address a lot of these problems. You don't necessarily want to just say the rules are this, rules are that, rules are that. You explain things in a way that gets them to practice virtue, or see that virtue wasn't practiced and they should practice virtue instead.
Yeah. And that's great advice on the other conversation as well. As a dad, with one of my boys, went down that road, made that mistake, and it was like they weren't ready because I just started explaining stuff, and they weren't ready for it. And all of a sudden I was like, "Oh, brakes, pull back, pull back, mayday."
in a certain sense, obviously you don't want to expose them to too much too early. But I think the unfortunate thing that we tend to do, probably a little bit out of fear, is that we expose them to too little, not early enough. And they're going to find out from somewhere. Usually friends or brothers, or sometimes the internet. That was the whole sort of Digital Dangers series that we just finished up, right? Yeah,
exactly.
They're going to find out from somewhere. And if they find out from you, you can teach them virtue. If they find out from their friends, good luck.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And certainly not from online.
Yeah.
So much better coming from you.
Yeah, indeed.
We already kind of talked about this question a little bit, but you touched on this when you said the natural law. The natural law dictates that a child has a mother and a father. Mm-hmm. Again, this is the best scenario, so that would seem to skew the scale a little bit in the realm of getting married. What do you say to that, Father?
Well, I think yes, in the sense that we do want a child to have a mother and a father. That's the ideal. And studies will bear out the fact that a child with a mother and a father, the biological mother and father, is the most stable situation. But the question ends up being, right, is marriage under the conditions that we could put out here going to actually produce a stable Catholic family? Is it going to have to help the child save its soul? Stability and this ideal of a mother and father are a means to an end. They're not just unqualified goods. We have to look at the end. We've talked about that a number of different times in the podcast I've been on, this idea of finality. We need the goal. What's the goal, right? If we're not getting to that goal, it doesn't matter what the means are. The means are bad, right? If marriage in this situation doesn't produce the salvation of the soul, something is wrong. Not maybe necessarily the marriage, but maybe going into it. And so depriving the child of a stable family if we don't enter into marriage, well, if we began with a lack of virtue, like I said before, marriage isn't going to cause stability or cause virtue in that situation. It's that we have to step back and see whether this is actually going to cause the means to an end that we're seeking. And if it doesn't, it's not prudent, right? Prudence takes stock of the data that you have, sees there. You could also look at it this way. I remember we made a calendar when I was in New Zealand, and we did the virtues and for each month, sort of like the Angelus Press calendar, right? Mm-hmm. But it was far too expensive to get the Angelus Press calendar overseas, all of those kinds of things. So we did it over there. And there was this beautiful thing, I think it was for March, on prudence. Maybe April. And it was this 3-headed man with an old face and a young face. And then in the middle, just kind of a middle-aged guy, right? probably more like me here. Maybe I'm getting a little old or something like that now. But in any case, it was the young man. It was the sort of the past. It was the present and the future. And it's, again, an example of prudence, right? You take stock of what's happened. You make decisions now in provision of the future, right? And that's basically those three acts that we're thinking there. You take the data, looking at the past, looking at the present, what you can do now for the future, right? Again, it's a question of prudence. If marriage is going to help this situation, you have to look at the data, you have to make a decision and see if it's going to lead to that end. The stability there that we have will help, yes, but if we're not going to have stability, marriage isn't going to help.
Right. Another pushback often is I know when my wife she was working for a time and she was expecting and her hands got really swollen when she was far along, and so she wasn't wearing her rings. And so she was at work, and an old lady, of course, it's always an old lady, came in and poked at her belly and said, "When are you going to make that baby legitimate?" My wife was obviously wanted to slap her. But that's sort of a thing. And it is a thing in our culture of legitimacy of the child. Can we, quote unquote, fix that by getting married? And also, can you speak about a little bit about the status of legitimate or illegitimate children? Because that's been a consideration in the past for a number of things.
So do the right thing, make the child legitimate. I'm not sure that slapping the old women like that tend to mean very well. I mean, she's obviously trying to encourage something that she thinks to be right, and that might be the right action. It might be good to fix that problem. But whatever is right, and we can put the quotes around that, whatever is right is what's going to promote our ultimate end, our salvation and God's glory. In this case, the salvation of the child, salvation of the parents, the glory of God. What is right isn't some formalistic ideal that's separated from reality, right? We look at the real situation. That's prudence, right? We're not just legalists. Oh, well, you better get married because this child's not going to be legitimate anyway. The legitimate from leges, right? It's legal. Okay. Again, marriage may promote salvation, but it might not, right? Bad marriages can be the nucleus for a lot of problems. As Chesterton even says that marriage is a battle to the death. So we have to consider that if this battle is going on and it's not a battle for virtue, it might be a battle that undermines, hitching the wagon and taking everybody to hell with us, right? And a marriage under force or under a compulsion, psychological or otherwise, that is invalid as it could be under certainly that's not going to fix anything, right? It's not even a valid sacrament at that point in time. So it's not a vehicle for grace. We don't want to force people into a situation where they think that this is the only solution. Do the right thing, make the child, maybe, but we have to consider all of those other things. It has to be looked at again with prudence. But you asked about sort of legitimacy and the status. I'd have to say it's somewhat sad. It's more or less a meaningless concept in today's world, even in the church law. There's a few exceptions to that, and maybe they're more sort of hearkening back to a problem that exists, but maybe isn't the illegitimacy part of it. But there's very few things in today's world that, people aren't really going to bat an eye about your legitimacy or not. Maybe in our circles as traditional Catholics, there's a concern about it on a level, but I think even more and more, sometimes the world seeps into our own circles and we get used to these kinds of situations happening. And I know plenty of them where this situation, there's a bad marriage situation or somebody has had a child out of wedlock, whatever. And we need to deal with them. And so legitimacy is an important concept, but it's mostly meaningless except in a few little areas of church law these days, mostly touching on ordination and religious life. So it's still an issue there, not because, again, of a legalistic thing, but because of going back that whole idea of stability, right? And the whole idea of having a good father who gives you an image of God, and the mother that leads you to the Father and is an image of the church and Our Lady. And so if you have this idea that your mother is not a good woman, you're never going to trust our Holy Mother, the Church, as a good bride of Christ, right? So the authority that comes from there. If you don't have a good father, you're rarely going to be able to trust the priest, the father, right? Or the Holy Father, or many other people. And so it's not the legitimacy that's the issue. It's the broken home that's the issue. And legitimacy is just a way of saying, in most cases, that was it. But I mean, there's plenty of families, I'm sure you've experienced that they're married, but they might as well just, that the home life is such that it's bad for the children. And they're getting this same instability even within a married family, right? So it used to be in canon law where a priest had to be legitimate for ordination. It was an impediment to his ordination. It's not the case anymore, and it was easily dispensed before. But it's an impediment simply because there could be, as a result of that, there could be an instability in his own spiritual life, his own psychological life. And we can't have a priest who's supposed to be a leader of souls, a leader of anything, of a parish, whatever. We can't have him in a situation where he might mislead them.
Right. And again, it's not a punishment of the person who is illegitimate by any means. It's a matter of, again, prudence for the good of the whole in the community and the future of his flock. It's
not a punishment. It's a protection. I think a lot of times we don't see that is restrictions on us sometimes end up being protections for us. Not punishments necessarily, whether it's the apostolate that we do as a priest, or whether it's the thing that we can't do because of this, that, or the other thing. If that person goes all the way through the seminary and isn't ordained, and he was just cheated out of that. Well, first, no one has the right to ordination, but what happens there? Maybe in God's providence, this isn't a punishment, but he was let go. He left. Why? Because Providence understood that if he continued down this path, there was that horrific decision in a moment of imprudence that he was going to make. And as a result of that, he might not save his soul very easily and damage many others, right? Otherwise, a great man. So we see that sometimes these restrictions on our liberty, these restrictions on us in certain ways, end up being actually protections for us, not punishments. Even if it looks like it may, and maybe somebody who doesn't understand that may look at it as, well, you're illegitimate, as if that's something shameful to be. No, okay, you could be a great person and just not have parents who are wed properly in the church, or couldn't be, right? Still, there might be an instability there. And so canon law used to be very careful about what happened there. In fact, canon law was very happy to solve this problem for people, right? If you wanted to be made legitimate, you could join a religious order. And there were certain religious orders that would accept as simple brothers and sisters, right? Those who have particular impediments to entering the priesthood, or those who have other deficiencies. I know there are certain orders that would take sick people, for instance, in order to give them a consecrated life. They knew they couldn't do that. I think the little sisters in Lourdes do that with some of their sisters. Some of them are infirmed, right? But they're able to do some things, right? And the canon law was very clear. You could become legitimate by joining religion, entering into religious life. But generally speaking, you are still prohibited from ever running a religious order, but from becoming any kind of superior or novice mistress or master or something like that. Because again, stability, right? If this was generally a bigger problem with the female religious orders. But it would happen with others too. If you don't have a good concept of a father who is stable, when that bishop tells you to do something that you don't want to do, when that superior tells you not, or that priest says, don't do this, or I want you to do this, and it's legitimate for them to do that, what's your reaction? That's just like Dad, right? And he was a bad man, and I'm not going to listen to him because, we can distrust our father. We can distrust God the Father. We can distrust the Holy Mother, the Church, our mother, if we have this warped image of what's there. So we shouldn't really hang our hat too much on this question of legitimacy, especially in today's world. Even if the church does, for various reasons, still keep this concept, at least to prevent those who maybe have an instability in their own life from entering into religion and becoming a problem for the faithful, for others around us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Last question I have, Father, on this topic is regarding, let's say there's a situation where, again, we're using the example of a unwed mother, but how should she encourage the relationship with the father, and how should that relationship, again, that's a really big question that we don't really have time for, but how would you counsel that relationship? Because it is still a relationship, even if they decide it's better to not get married.
Sure.
What are the roles to play there, Father?
Well, we go back to that big ugly P word, prudence. Right? We're back at the same thing, right? We have to look at this. We have to take the data here. Both the mother and the father have a duty to support the child. Now, the custody question is a civil law question. Morally speaking, the child must be raised Catholic. There's no question there. There is a moral obligation. It's a grave moral obligation to give this child what it needs to save its soul. If we're not going to do that, well, we're basically signing the child up for its ticket to hell right now. And we must not do that. Now, the different way that this relationship is fostered or not fostered is going to depend a lot on the character of each person. Is this father even known? Right? Is this person able to be contacted, or do they want anything to do with this child? If they don't, if they're not going to be virtuous, maybe it's a better idea to keep them far away. Right? Maybe it's a better idea to not encourage any relationship whatsoever. Again, that will be difficult to explain to a child. But you know what? There are those difficult things. And again, we explain it at their level, et cetera. Right. The fourth commandment isn't like we said before, an unqualified obligation or good. It's a relative good, and it relates to those who have an authority in the child's life or in our lives and are exercising that. Right. I'm a priest now of the District of the United States. Right. My superior is Father Fullerton. When I was in Australia, I actually had Father Fullerton for a little while there too, and then Father Thiemann after that. Right? So I've moved here. My superior is no longer Father Thiemann, even though he's a good priest and even though I have a great respect for him and maybe ask some counsel of him. But he's not going to be giving me orders. And so that fourth commandment, my duty under that as a priest related to him at that point in time when he had that, now relates to Father Fullerton. It related to Father Fullerton before. If I have a new superior, then I will have that. So the same thing with the child, like the authority that in that child's life relates to those who actually exercise that authority, and the duty relates to that. That has to be promoted. And maybe that's going to be grandpa. Maybe dad's not in the life. Grandpa takes that role. Maybe mom is a bit of an absent mother, and grandpa and grandma are taking care of the child. Where is that authority need to go? It needs to go to grandpa and grandma, right? It doesn't need to go to mom, I know of there's some sad cases, right? Mom's maybe, a drug addict and she's not around and the children are being taken care of by somebody else. In that situation, she's not owed the kind of respect or at least, obedience that somebody is owed like grandpa who's taking care of him. Right. Should you try to foster that relationship if somebody fixes that up? Maybe. It's a question of prudence. Right. But there's a moral duty to support. Definitely. That has to be encouraged. Where possible, if people are trying to be good Catholics, but they just decide not to get married, fair enough. But then they still need to support each other. And maybe there's going to be visitation and custody. But the question of custody isn't about, I want my kid, right? I want my time with my kid. It's what is going to be best for this child to become a good Catholic, right? That's the ultimate question. That's the prudent question. And that's what we always have to cycle back to on these kinds of questions. So the relationship situation here, if not married, is going to look different in each individual case. It's going to look different if they get married and if they don't get married too. But it always has to come back to this question of prudence. Yeah.
There's a lot here to chew on, Father. And I guess as a closing, I would just say, for any young people who are, or not young people who are listening or watching, your actions have consequences, and this is very real. dating and being impure is not what I tell my boys is this isn't a contact sport. Sorry if that's crass or rude, but
no,
I mean, right. It's in a way that they can understand, like, this is not a sport. This is not something you play with. You're bringing a child into this life, potentially into this world, and how that child views you is how they view God. And that's really sobering.
Yeah. And step back just a little bit, so many, in the modern world, it's so common, like, you're 13 years old and you have your boyfriend or your girlfriend, and, that's normal that you do that kind of thing. There was something going around. Somebody sent me a little blurb from the internet about some story of a man who more or less, beat up the boy who was invited over when his daughter and he went upstairs, and they closed the door, and there was a no closed door policy. Like, why? First question is, why are they even there? Right? Yeah. They're 13. You can't get married legally, maybe you could get married at 13 in some places, not in the church's law, but okay, maybe you could get legally married. Are you fit for marriage at that point in time? Absolutely not. Right? You have no business entering into a relationship that is naturally ordered towards marriage at the end and testing to see whether you're ready. If you're not ready within a year, 2 years, or something close to that, right? That's why counseling. I think I've said this before when we were talking about other things. The young man comes in and he says, "Father, I'm having doubts about my faith," and you ask the question, "What's her name?"
Yeah.
Right. It's too often when we start down that path, we justify what we want to do by throwing away what the church teaches us to do. We want to throw out the teaching because it helps us to reconcile those morals, right? But these things are for a purpose. And if we get ourselves involved in relationships where we have no business being there, we're putting ourselves in almost, you could say, a constant life of sin, of this occasion of sin. A teenager, in most cases, dating. I mean, there may be an exception or two here and there. I know of a few that even priests have said, okay, under your circumstance, this is fine while you're still in high school. But I mean, I would imagine most of our schools are going to more or less kick people out if they're doing that, and for good reason, and I've told parents before and from the pulpit, like, if you're letting your kids do this, don't show up at my communion rail. You're not worthy to communion until you solve that problem and you make a confession of it. If you're letting your children, play around with sin and thinking somehow that, they're going to be virtuous enough to fix this, they're not, right? It's the constant refrain from when we have to deal with our mortal sins, right? Why does God allow us to fall? Because we said, well, I got this. You don't got this. And as soon as we think we do, God sometimes gives us a nice rude awakening. Hopefully that's not in the form of a child that's going to then affect our entire life going forward. But if that's the consequence of our action, we have a duty to do the best we can to be a good father, a good mother, and a good Catholic, and help turn this child into a saint. Because that's ultimately why God gives us children. He wants saints for heaven. He doesn't want mediocre Christians. He wants saints for heaven. And parents, married or not, have a duty to produce those saints for heaven.
Great words to end on, Father Palko. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it so much.
No problem at all. God bless.
You too. Thanks for listening to this episode of Questions with Father on the SSPX Podcast and on our YouTube page. Please consider subscribing to the YouTube account and to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever fine podcasts are found. And please consider leaving a rating or a review on the podcast. This will make sure that more people can find these episodes and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. Until next time, thank you for joining us, and God bless you.